Hey there folks, welcome to Spectrum Pulse. We talk about music, movies, art, and culture. And today we're going to be talking about the newest album from Tegan and Sara called Love You to Death. So let's go back to the topic of selling out. Now, a few episodes back, I raised the point about how even when it didn't involve the shift in genre, that selling out wasn't inherently a bad thing. Hell, sometimes it's the first chance for bands to develop a knack for melody or hooks that they never bothered with in the past. And for those who do pivot towards pop music, well, pop sensibility isn't exactly a bad thing if it leads to populism without compromising artistic identity. Or hell, even if it does, if the hooks are irresistible, I'm prepared to forgive a lot. You want a perfect example of that? Tegan and Sara, the Canadian indie rock identical twins that developed a decent amount of buzz in Canada, but I would never consider them an act that I really liked. Sure, they have a couple songs in that genre that I kind of enjoyed, the most notable being the title track from their 2007 album, The Con, but for the most part, I was never really all that impressed by their songwriting or their hooks, even if I could appreciate some of the unique ideas that colored albums like Sainthood. They were always a band that I wanted to like a lot more than I actually did, and yet, in 2013, they partnered with producer Greg Kurstin, who worked with nearly every mainstream pop act for the past decade, to release Heartthrob. That album was an outright pivot towards synthpop, and I'll handily say it was the best album that they've ever released. It wasn't quite a great record, it falls off after the first 6 or so songs, and I wasn't wild about the gratuitous pitch correction, but it was such a better fit for indie rock for the pair, if only because it accentuated the strength of their melodies, and better fit the lighter scope of their writing. And while everyone loved Closer, I was a lot more impressed with I Was a Fool, which is one of my favorite songs of 2013 and still holds up remarkably well. But now, it's 3 years later. Tegan and Sara ditched all other producers besides Greg Kurstin, and the edit for this album looked tighter than ever before. And yeah, sure, Greg Kurstin's star might have been tarnished a little bit with overexposure between Sia, Lily Allen, and Kelly Clarkson. He's been attached to far too much lackluster pop music in recent years. But I had a lot of faith that the band could synthesize something pretty awesome here. So, did they make it work? Well, honestly, I've been sitting on this review for a couple of days now, really trying to puzzle it out, and while this is a good record, I'm not sure that Love You to Death by Tegan and Sara is their best work. I don't think it's better than Heartthrob, and while it does have a few moments in the writing and performance that I think really do redeem it, it's honestly not an album that I find all that interesting or deeply engaging. In other words, the definition of a decent, if forgettable album, and man, I don't want to say that. Because where things get complicated is explaining why, because this album should work better for me than it does. For one, the writing's pretty on point. Tegan and Sara have always been deft pop songwriters in capturing a certain emotional complexity that lends their pop songs nuance. Most of the situations that they describe could be resolved with a certain blunt honesty or very logical course of actions, and Tegan and Sara are very much aware of that, but emotions, they don't really work that way, and the duo gets that too. Take That Girl, for example, where the protagonist is stuck in a really crappy relationship and is infuriated that she's become the girl who gets walked over, with the central conflict being more of self-confidence than anything else. The best song on this album is the stripped back piano ballad 100 Times. It's probably the best example. Framed as a breakup where long stewing emotions are finally at the surface because she's wanted to leave 100 times before and now is finally leaving, which cuts even heavier when you realize that Sara wrote the song specifically about the possibility of the pair splitting apart. Emotions that are also really well captured in the more abstract conflict of White Knuckles. And one other thing I appreciate is that Tegan and Sara are playing into the queer side of their writing a little bit stronger. Yeah, the undercurrents and subtext were there on previous albums, but songs like Boyfriend and Be With You bring it into the main text. In the former case, asking a girl to stop treating her like a sexual experiment and more like a relationship, and in the latter case, driving the reassurance that their love is strong, but they don't need the wedding and white dress and tradition. But if I'm going to come down on the writing and performance at all, I still feel there's untapped potential here. For one, as strong as the vocal harmonies are, I wish the songwriting took more chances and played off their more distinctive voices more, playing them off each other in the narrative as well as in the vocals. Beyond that, a lot of the writing is remarkably tight for pop song work, but there is definitely cases where it can ring a little bit awkward or even formulaic. Album Closer, Hang On to the Night is probably the biggest culprit, but the hook on Faint of Heart always felt a little bit clumsy to me. And then there are the songs where the scenario just doesn't quite click together, the biggest being Dying to Know. It was already a bit of a messy song instrumentally, and yeah, we'll get to that, but lyrically it feels a little bit confused as well, trying to balance moving on with the curiosity of knowing what an ex is doing in their life right now. And yeah, I totally get the emotional sentiment driving the song, we've all had that impulse, but it's also the song that seems the least self-aware, and that does hurt it. it. Contrast that to U-Turn, where the song does plenty to highlight the protagonist's own failings and getting called on them for a change, and hell, on that song, the protagonist almost seems too self-flagellating, to the point where they're almost making excuses to save the relationship, doing everything to the point it almost comes across like a pose. But that's not the biggest issue with this album, and here's where we gotta talk about the instrumentation and the production. And let me clarify right out of the gate that as melodic composers, Tegan and Sara have always been kind of hit and miss with me. But in recent years, they've scored more hits than misses. And on a melodic level, I'm not saying this album doesn't have hooks. I don't think we're ever gonna get any sort of instantly memorable moments like Closer or I Was a Fool or even Goodbye. And there was some good moments here. And hell, I could even get behind their choice to ditch guitars altogether for keyboards. Wouldn't have been my choice for synthpop, especially considering I prefer more groove and punch, but this could have worked. The problem, honestly, I think it's Greg Kurstin here. I don't know if it's overexposure to his particular brand of sound, or he's just not delivering in the way he did at his peak, but there's a real lack of color to this album, not helped by a focus on percussion over actual melody. Take the hook of That Girl. It's anchored by the faded backing piano and some glassy synth, but it seems much more focused on the bassy hits and the gloss of the track rather than the underlying melody beneath it. Or take the melody on Faint of Heart. It's so muted throughout the verses in the bassy tones that when it's tried to pull on the hook with more flair, the clatter of the thicker drums and percussion in all tones just drowns it out. It's an issue of the beat textures taking precedent over any melody itself, to the point where I want to give Dying to Know a pass here for the plucky tone that opens up the track that falls into these low, buzzing fragments and very sandy percussion that doesn't favor any tune. And what's bizarre is how much the album wants to emulate 80s synthpop. The production never really gives it the scope and swell to hit those killer hooks the same way that Bleachers or even Carly Rae Jepsen did with their interpretations over the past couple of years. And I kinda get why. This record has a more intimate focus lyrically, and there's that tightness there that approaches on tracks like Be With You that almost approaches an act like LaRue. But when this album has a workable melodic hook like There or on the hookup of Stop Desire, it almost seems like it's in spite of the production. And when you have melodies like that, not emphasizing them is a critical mistake, especially when the production doesn't get varied or colorful enough in order to compensate for any of it. So look, overall, I think most Tegan and Sara fans will be on board with Love You to Death, but I really don't like it as much as I wanted to. And it's in large part thanks to Greg Kurstin's stubborn refusal to evolve past the retro 80s production that has identifiable problems putting percussion over melody for at least the past couple of years in modern pop music. It's a trend that we've seen before, and this album doesn't really rise above it. And while he definitely has produced music that I like and brings a certain punch and tightness here, the emotions and melodies of this album need a lot more spark and color to them to really stand out. And as such, I'm just not really gripped by this album. We're just coming in at a strong 6 out of 10 and a recommendation, but a slightly qualified one. If you're looking for a pretty sleek, reasonably well-written synthpop album that you could probably end up forgetting in a week or two, you'll probably like this, but otherwise, well, you can definitely get worse, so most of the time I would take this, but again, they've made better. So yeah, thanks a lot for watching. If you'd like to like and subscribe, I'd be more than grateful. Got the poll up here, so everyone who wants to tell me that Tegan and Sara are far better than me, you've got the option. Yeah, I want to like this album. It just did not stick with me. I planned this review for 2-3 days ago and just was not clicking for me in any way, shape, or form. Beyond that, anything else I might be able to do to improve my presentation, or any other albums coming up that you want me to take a look at, I will try to give them a listen. Got a lot of country on my plate, so you can expect that for the next 2 or 3 episodes. Till then, I'm Mark, you're watching Spectrum Pulse, and I'll see you next time.